Hello, and welcome to the Distiller's Cottage here in Middleton. My name is Quinn, and I'm the Archivist for Jameson Irish Whiskey. And I'm going to tell you the story of our wonderful whiskey, the most shared Irish whiskey in the world. Now, the story begins almost 250 years ago now, back in 1780. And that's when an entrepreneurial young man called John Jameson came to Dublin and set up the Bow Street Distillery. He was a person with a vision. He wanted to create a whiskey that would bear his name and would last down the generations, and that's exactly what he did. And if you go to Dublin today, which I hope you will, and you visit Bow Street, you can actually walk on the very same footpath, the same cobblestones as John Jameson did back in 1780. And as his distillery grew, so did his family. He was married to Margaret, who was known as Peggy, and together they had 16 children. I'm going to let that one sink in. 16 children, so cheers Margaret. And one of those children, John Jameson II, in 1805, he joined his father working at the Bow Street Distillery. And here at the archive, we've got an awful lot of records from John Jameson II, including this one. It's his own notebook from 1826. He was a hands-on distiller, and it's where he writes down the mash bills, or the recipes, for Jameson Irish whiskey. Now, I could show you the recipe, but I think you know that I can't. And so as the distillery grew, so did the reputation for Jameson whiskey. And by the time John Jameson III was in charge, that's 1851, it's been sold all over the world. And that's because it was regarded as a premium drink. Jameson whiskey was a byword for quality. So it's been sold in North America, South America, Australia, New Zealand, India, you name it. Jameson Irish whiskey was being sold there. It was an incredible success story. And as the whiskey was being sold all over the world, the distillery itself grew to the point that by the 1880s, it's stretching over 6 acres of Dublin city centre. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine trying to pay rent on 6 acres of a capital city? Today, absolutely impossible. And this is an image of the Bow Street Distillery in its heyday in the 1880s. Isn't it fantastic looking? Really, really vast. And so as it grew, and as the reputation grew, things were looking good. And by the time that John Jameson IV was in charge, this is around now the turn of the 19th, 20th century, things were looking rosy, which is unfortunate because that's when things started to go wrong. Now, it was nothing to do with the whiskey or nothing to do with the distillery. It was external political circumstances combined to almost bring about the destruction of the entire Irish whiskey category. And it starts back with the First World War. Ireland, you might know, is an island, and that means all the exports, including Jameson whiskey, had to be put on a ship to leave Ireland. And during the First World War, a lot of these merchant ships were sunk and all their cargoes were lost. This was devastating. So with no exports, what could Jameson do? Well, they did what they did best. They just put their heads down and they kept on distilling. So much so that in 1919, the records in the archive show they had their best distilling season ever, which is misfortunate because you might know what's coming next. It's Prohibition. 1920, and the doors of America are shut to Jameson. It was against the law to export and to sell Irish whiskey in the United States. And the Jameson family, they were people of high morals, you know, they had integrity. So if the law said, don't do this, they didn't. Now, you might hear a lot of stories about bootleggers and politicians trying to bring Irish whiskey in, but the Jamesons didn't get involved in any of that. And I'm pretty pleased that they didn't, because all of that kind of smuggling and bootlegging, Well, we know where that led to. It led to a breakdown in law and order and the rise of organised crime. So I actually think it's to Jameson's credit that they didn't get involved. So Prohibition lifted, that was good news. What was bad news though was it's the 1930s and Ireland entered into a trade war with our nearest neighbour, that's Great Britain. And that meant we couldn't trade with territories such as Canada, such as India, such as Australia, such as New Zealand. All of a sudden the world for Jameson shrunk. The world for Irish whiskey really shrunk. And to top that, here comes the Second World War. It's the same thing again. We can't export off the island. So by the time the 1950s come, Irish whiskey is in incredible distress. Distillery after distillery is closing. The actual ability to make Irish whiskey is being lost. The industry had hit a crisis. By the 1960s, you've only got 3 distilleries left who actually make Irish whiskey. That's John Jameson and Son, John Power and Son, both in Dublin, and in Cork, the Middleton Distillery. What to do? Well, the owners, they were all family-owned and family-run, descendants of their founders. The owners of these 3 distilleries knew they had to do something radical, something truly spectacular to save Irish whiskey, and they did. They had been rivals for almost 200 years, and in 1966 they put aside all that rivalry and they came together to form a new company, Irish Distillers. And the first thing they did was to look at the production of the whiskey. Now, the Bow Street distillery that had been a glittering edifice in Dublin city centre, and that kind of was the problem. It was in Dublin city centre. It was no longer fit for purpose. The small streets around Bow Street, they couldn't facilitate the large lorries and tankers that you need for a modern distillery. So in 1975, production was moved to Middleton in County Cork, where on a greenfield site, the most advanced distillery in Europe was built. Now at the time, the company was making quite a lot of different whiskies, all wonderful, wonderful names. Redbreast, the Spot range, Middleton whiskey itself, and Powers. But they didn't have enough in the tank to put behind all these whiskies. They had to pick one that they would put all their energy and their belief behind to save the Irish whiskey category. And that whiskey was Jameson. And that's exactly what it did. With all their efforts behind it, Jameson once again was sold all over the world and was welcomed by all the consumers. And whatever way you like to drink it, you might like to drink it neat, you might like to drink it on the rocks, you might like it in a cocktail, you might like it as a Jameson ginger and lime. We don't mind. We're just so thrilled that once again, you and your friends are enjoying Jameson whiskey the way it should be enjoyed, with a smile on your face. So that's really our story. It goes back to 1780, to the dream and the vision of one man. Countless generations since then have worked hard to keep the quality and the taste of Jameson whiskey as perfect as it absolutely can be. And I hope that one day you're going to be able to join us in person and perhaps visit Bow Street, our heart and home in Dublin. And when you're in Ireland, please do come down to the Jameson Distillery at Middleton and see where our Jameson whiskey, the best-selling Irish whiskey in the world, is made today. So until that day, and until you can join us physically, I'd like to say sláinte to you. Goodbye.